Sunday, 1st of January, 1995. HM Prison, Birmingham. A man is found dead in his prison cell. Hanged. He had not been convicted yet, but obviously wanted to cheat the system out of justice for the disgusting crimes that he had committed. This man was one half of the worst serial killer couples in British history, stripping the life from 12 innocent girls, some of which were their own children. Today, Descent into Darkness examines the disgusting crimes of Fred and Rose West. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on the 29th of September 1941. His parents were Walter and Daisy, and they lived in the picturesque English village of Much Marcle in Herefordshire. The family were farm workers. Walter ruled with an iron fist of a typical no-nonsense agricultural worker, whereas his mother was overbearingly protective of her wee lad. By 1951, the West family had grown by a further 7 children, but sadly, only 6 of the 8 survived. 3 girls and 3 boys. The family moved to a property called Moorcourt Cottage attached to Moorcourt Farm when Fred was 5 years old. From very early on, Fred was expected to muck in and with the various jobs and chores along with his siblings when they reached a similar age. Typical countryside seasonal tasks such as fruit picking, crop harvesting and pest control. Through this lifestyle, Fred had quickly developed a very strong work ethic, but later had also begun a habit of petty theft, a compulsion that would stay with him for the rest of his days. Unfortunately, his school days were not a particularly good time for him. He never learned to properly read or write, and his general appearance was always very shabby and scruffy. He did do well in art and woodwork, though, so it wasn't a total write-off for him. It would appear that Fred was a born liar as well, as he claimed that his parents introduced him to incest and bestiality, a notion his brother Doug would dismiss as utter rubbish many years later. In his teen years, Fred and his brother John would regularly go to a youth club in the nearby town of Ledbury. Unfortunately, Fred was bullied due to his incredibly strong West Country accent, the British equivalent of a redneck in the USA. And for those of you that don't know, a generic West Country accent sounds something like this. When he was 17, Fred came off his motorbike and had suffered some serious injuries due to him not wearing any protective clothing, most notably a helmet. He suffered a broken arm, a broken leg, and more worryingly, a fractured skull. What is worse is that only 2 years later he suffered another severe head injury after he fell from a fire escape at the youth club, but it turns out that he kinda deserved it, as he had fallen due to trying to sexually assault a girl who had then turned round and caught him upside the face with a cracking punch. Good lass. Many have speculated that these cranial injuries resulted in a significant personality change. This certainly could possibly explain the next horrific detail, when Fred was outed by his sister Kitty to his parents, accusing him of raping her. Understandably, Fred was instantly ostracized from the family and was put on trial for it on the 9th of November 1961. Apparently, his reaction to the shocking revelation was, "Doesn't everybody do it?" No! The trial collapsed, however, when Kitty suddenly changed her mind and no longer wanted to testify. Fred, no longer welcome at his family home, had moved out to live with his Aunt Violet. At the age of 21, Fred met and began dating Catherine Rena Costello, a Scottish lassie from Lanarkshire. Rena was already pregnant with another man's child, a man of Asian descent. On the 17th of November 1962, the couple married. Rena's first child, Charmaine, was born in March of 1963. Initially, they moved into Rena's hometown of Coatbridge, where Fred found work as an ice cream van man. They felt the need to explain away Charmaine's mixed race by claiming that Rena had actually miscarried and Charmaine was adopted. Any woman or family that has had to suffer through the heartache of a miscarriage will no doubt be appalled right now that someone could lie about it, and that doesn't even take into account the obvious racism element. The couple soon moved house, ended up in the Bridgeton area of Glasgow, Later, in July 1964, Rena gave birth to their first child, together, called Anne-Marie. A neighbour and occasional nanny, Isa McNeil, described Rena as a considerate mother, but was struggling to bring up the two children. It should come as a surprise to virtually no one to learn that Fred was not a very nice father. He wouldn't allow them to roam around the house whilst he was home, caging the children in the bottom bunk of a set of bunk beds, which he screwed wooden bars across the space in between. Fred was not the faithful type either. He had numerous affairs with other women in his first year of marriage, and even had an illegitimate child to Alaska from the Gorbals area of the city. Rena had found out about these affairs, and so, as revenge, had started seeing a friend named John McLaughlin on the side. However, Fred found them both together, and in a fit of rage, he punched Rena square in the face. McLaughlin then punched Fred, who drew a knife, but John wasn't fazed by it, throwing a second punch, at which Fred gave up. Like the true woman-beating coward. On one occasion, whilst Fred was out in his ice cream van, a wee boy asked him for an ice cream. Fred simply slapped the youngster away with a harsh clip around the head. After dishing out a sound beating to Fred for this, John McLaughlin said of Fred's parenting and relationship style, "An ordinary man would have just given the child some ice cream, but instead he smashed him round the head with his horn. He was a violent and sadistic bastard who enjoyed beating up women and kids. You couldn't tackle a man, but wasn't he slow in attacking a woman?" Astoundingly, Fred and Rena stayed together, but she became the target of physical abuse more and more, frequently having black eyes or bruises all over. On each occasion that he did, though, McLaughlin would find him and give him six of the best in return. In December of 1965, Fred took both children and fled back down to England, along with Isa McNeil and her friend Anne McFall, to help look after the kids, as the previous month, Fred had accidentally run over and killed a small child. Although the police cleared him of any blame, he greatly feared the backlash from the community. He rented a caravan at a campsite in Bishop's Cleeve near Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire, finding work at a local slaughterhouse as a delivery driver. Rena joined them all in the January of the following year. However, it does not take a genius to work out that all was not well. Rena and Isa wanted to escape the constant beatings and abuse, and so they secretly planned to get away with the help of John McLaughlin, hoping to take the children away as well. Unfortunately, Fred found out about the plan, possibly through Anne McFall, who by this time had become totally besotted with Fred. He treated her significantly better than he did Rena or Isa. When it came to the appointed 0 hour for the escape, Fred was there and held on tightly to Charmaine and Anne-Marie, refusing to let them go, even after McLaughlin had given him a good few smacks around the chops. The police were called, leading to the rest making a hasty exit without the children. As they sped off, Fred shouted to Rena, threatening if he ever saw her again, he would kill her. The dust from the car tires settled, and Fred West was left with his two daughters and Anne McFall, but this would not last long. Rena tried to maintain occasional contact with her daughters. She had become more and more resentful, both toward Fred for keeping her children from her, and for her erstwhile friend McFall's increasing role in the girls' lives. In an act of petty revenge, Rena had stolen some things from Fred, who reported her to the police. She was arrested and charged with theft, and ordered to serve 3 years on probation. July 1967. Anne McFall, aged 18. Young Anne had left school at the then standard age of 15 and had gone to work at a knitwear factory in Glasgow. Anne had lost her boyfriend to a workplace death and had spiralled into a deep depression. She earned a little bit of extra money on the side by taking a job of looking after Fred and Rena's children whilst they were at work. She had met the Wests through their mutual friend, Isa McNeil, both women helping Rena as she struggled with the 2 wee girls. 3 years later, she and McNeil moved down to England with Fred when he escaped the perceived public backlash from his running over of the child. Both women had also hoped to find fresh opportunities south of the border, as the rough areas of Glasgow provided very little. According to Fred, Anne constantly flirted with him, Supposedly, he was in fact seeing both Anne and Isa at the same time. Whether this is true or not, what is true is that at the time of her disappearance is that she was heavily pregnant, and Fred was the father. Fred confided in someone after his eventual capture that he had stabbed Anne to death after a heated argument. However, there was evidence on her body that she had been restrained by the wrists by a dressing gown cord. This is highly inconsistent with a spur-of-the-moment attack. Due to her being largely unknown in the area of Gloucestershire and far away from home, Anne was never reported missing. Her remains, along with those of her unborn baby, were discovered not far from Muchmarcle in June of 1994. Rosemary Pauline Letts was born on the 29th of November 1953 in Northam, Devon. Her parents were Bill and Daisy, Rose being the fifth of seven. Her family was very poor and Bill suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Daisy Letts suffered with chronic depression, and the archaic medical attitude of the time led to her being subjected to electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. What makes this even worse is that she was pregnant with Rose at the time. Some have speculated that this could have led to some form of fetal injury to tiny Rose. Could this have affected her development later down the line? Rose proved to be quite the lazy child at school. Her educational performance was almost non-existent, preferring to spend her time with her head in the clouds. Her parents separated some time during Rose's teen years, and when she was 16, she moved with her dad, Bill, to the village of Bishop's Cleeve. Unfortunately, perhaps due to Bill's mental illness, he was given to bouts of violence and had also begun to sexually abuse Rose and her eldest sister, Patricia. This was a regular occurrence and, understandably, badly affected her psychological development when it came to sex and her developing puberty. She started flaunting herself naked around the house, even in front of her father and brothers. She also began regularly sneaking into her brother's bedroom in the dead of night to molest him. Fred had first met Rose in 1969. He was 27, she was 15. Initially, she was quite repulsed by Fred's scruffy appearance and demeanour, but one thing Fred had in spades was charm, very quickly able to win over Rose's affection with the attention he lavished on her. One of his first acts was to send a gift to the local bakery where she worked. He had asked another woman to take it to her whilst he stood outside and waved, blowing a kiss. Rose was completely won over and began to regularly meet with Fred at the caravan park where he lived. She even became his de facto childminder. Rose noticed that Charmaine and Anne-Marie were not particularly well looked after, and so she quickly left her job at the bakery so that she could look after them full-time. Fred agreed to give her some money every Friday to make it seem to her parents like Rose was still employed. After seeing Fred for around 7 months, he was introduced to the family. Rose's parents highly disapproved of Rose dating Fred and ordered her to stop seeing him. Setting aside the obvious issue that Rose was 1 year below the UK age of consent and Fred was significantly older than that, Daisy had seen right through Fred's charm. Rose, of course, did fight her parents, which caused them to ring social services and tell them that their underage daughter was being groomed by a much older man. There was even some awful rumours that she had begun to engage in prostitution and was working out of Fred's caravan. Quite rightly, social services took Rose into care, placing her in a children's home. However, she was allowed to go home at weekends to see her parents and was not escorted to do so. Of course, she took this open-goal opportunity and snuck off to see Fred. When Rose turned 16, she was allowed to go back to living with her parents. At the same time this happened, Fred was in prison for a short time, having been convicted for a series of unpaid fines. His daughters were being looked after by social services until he was let out. By now he had moved away from the caravan site and was renting a small flat at 25 Midland Road in Gloucester. In February 1970, Rose was once again placed into care when it was discovered that she was pregnant, but was released only a month later after she agreed to have an abortion. Instead of going home, guess where she went instead? Feeling as though they had exhausted all of their options, Bill and Daisy told Rose that they didn't want to see her in their house ever again. A clean break thus achieved, Rose was now virtually free to do as she pleased. One of her first decisions was to not get that abortion. Rose gave birth to baby Heather on the 17th of October, 1970. 2 months afterward, Fred was imprisoned once more for 6.5 months on the charge of theft of car tires and a tax disc. At the age of only 17, Rose was left literally holding the baby, as well as having to look after Charmaine and Anne-Marie, who had by now taken to calling Rose Mum. Circa 15th to the 24th of June 1971. Charmaine West, aged 8. According to Anne-Marie's autobiography later in life, Charmaine was the frequent victim of harsh criticism, beatings, and other forms of abuse at the hands of Fred. This may well have been to her not being Fred's biological child. Rose's first foray into the twisted world of murder began shortly before Fred was due to be released from prison. She had taken all the kids to visit him in prison on the 15th of June 1971, with the release date set for the 24th of that month. At some point in between those dates, Rose had killed her and left her body in the coal store in the back garden to wait until Fred got back home from prison. When Fred had been released and had come home, far from being horrified at the murder, he quickly buried Charmaine's body in the back garden below the kitchen window in the dead of night. Both Charmaine and Anne-Marie used to regularly play with a girl named Tracy Giles, who lived with her parents in the upper flat of 25 Midland Road. They had moved out before Charmaine's murder, but Tracy had come back round to play a little while after. When Tracy asked where Charmaine was, Rose angrily replied, "She's gone away to live with her mother, and good bloody riddance." This excuse the couple kept to for anyone who asked after Charmaine's whereabouts. When Anne-Marie asked her dad why her mum had taken Charmaine and not her, Fred indifferently replied, "She wouldn't want you, love. You're the wrong colour," a callous reference to Charmaine's mixed-race parentage. August 1971. Catherine Rena West, née Costello, 26. Rena had lost touch since Fred had moved away from the caravan site to Gloucester, and she did not know where. She had become more and more anxious about her children's welfare and had asked Fred's family for his current address. They had given Rena the address and had the intention of finding Fred and asking him for custody of the 2 girls. Of course, she was not aware that Charmaine had already been murdered. Unfortunately, the time when Fred's family had handed over his address became the last confirmed time that Rena was ever seen alive. Fred had taken Rena away in his Ford Poplar. Perhaps she had been satisfied with seeing Anne-Marie, and with Fred fobbing her off with some excuse as to why Charmaine wasn't there. Whilst there is absolutely no certainty as to what exactly happened, it is believed that Fred had strangled her in the back seat of the car and then had dismembered her body, placing the pieces into plastic bags. Fred disposed of Rena's remains at a place called Letterbox Field, around a mile from Much Marcle. Her remains were found nearby Yew Tree Coppice, near the village of Kempley, in 1994, very close to where Anne McFall was found. Fred and Rose were married on the 29th of January 1972 at the Gloucester Registry Office. There was only one family member at the ceremony, Fred's brother John, Rose still being an outcast of her own family. A few months later, the family moved home, taking up residence at number 25 Cromwell Street, not far from Midland Road. Initially, the property was rented from the council, but many moons later, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's Right to Buy scheme of 1980, Fred was able to purchase the house from the council for £7,000, around $30,000 in today's money. Very soon after the family moved in, Rose had given birth to their second child. Fred began encouraging Rose to go on the game, selling her body via the personal ads. This reason was threefold. Firstly, Rose's sexual appetite was far greater than Fred's. Second, for some supplemental income. And third, Rose was bisexual, and so both could have the other female participant. Rose had also developed a sexually sadistic streak, engaging in choke play with her female partners and using toys of increasingly substantial girth on them, asking them, "Are you woman enough to take it?" Fred was a voyeur and liked to watch Rose with all her clients. He had made a few peepholes in the wall of the room set aside for the purpose so that he could watch without the client's knowledge. As sickening as it may sound, even Rose's dad, Bill, was a regular visitor to the West household so that he could have sex with his own daughter, all with Fred's blessing and encouragement. In fact, there is even speculation that Bill may have even been the father of Heather. When each of the remaining children had reached the age of 7, just as had happened in Fred's childhood, he set them on to performing various chores around the house. Only now, there was a much more sinister element attached to this. Anne-Marie was forced by Rose to wear incredibly revealing clothing such as miniskirts and low-cut tops. She would take great delight in tying her to various pieces of furniture and then encouraging Fred to have his way with her whilst Rose watched. It was not long before Anne-Marie was forced into prostitution also. She was only 13. The majority of the violent abuse the children were subjected to was perpetrated by Rose, but Fred was no slouch in that department either. The couple took in 1 or 2 lodgers at the house, again for Rose's enjoyment. Throughout their time in Cromwell Street, right up to their eventual capture, Fred would be constantly making alterations to the property with extensions and conversions. This detail would prove to have a highly sinister ulterior motive. In total, the couple had 5 children together: Heather, 1970, May, 1972, Stephen, 1973, Louise, 1978, and Barry, 1980. Rose also had 3 other daughters named Tara, Rosemary, and Luciana, who were all fathered by other male lodgers in the house. And I've also seen rumours that there may have been another girl called Barbara. How the hell did she get any sleep? For Christ's sake, she's been rogered more times than a policeman's radio. December 6th, 1972. Sexual assault of Caroline Owens, aged 17. On a dark night of October 1973, the Wests had been driving along a country road and had encountered a 17-year-old Caroline Owens. Caroline had been hitchhiking home to the small town of Cinderford from Tewkesbury after having visited her boyfriend. The Wests struck up a decent rapport with Owens and had offered her to become the full-time nanny of their children. The dangled carrot of steady employment was enough to persuade Caroline to accept. Caroline had moved into the house in Cromwell Street for convenience of the full-time commitment. When she saw the children, she later noted that Anne-Marie appeared to be highly introverted and timid. It did not take long for Caroline to become the new target of the West's sexual appetite. Rose had explained away her prostitution by claiming that she was in fact a masseuse. Fred talked incessantly about sex to her, and even claimed that he could perform abortions should she ever require one, as if he couldn't get any creepier. This unwanted sexual attention from the Wests caused Caroline to tell them that she no longer wanted the nanny job and left the house. Fred and Rose let her go, but quickly formulated a plan for the both of them to have her. They planned to abduct her from her usual route that she hitchhiked to and from her boyfriend's house. On the night of the 6th of December 1972, they found Caroline on the road and approached her on the pretext of an apology for how they acted toward her, and as a gesture of goodwill, offered her a ride home. Once she was inside the car and had gotten a short way down the road, Rose, who had sat on the back seat with her, began to reach over and fondle her. Fred then started asking highly personal questions. When Caroline asked them both to stop, Fred slammed on the brakes and turned to face her, angrily calling her a bitch, and punched her a couple of times until she passed out. The couple bound her hands with a scarf and taped her mouth shut. Then they drove her back to the house in Cromwell Street. Once back at the house, Owens was drugged and subjected to an incredibly sickening and prolonged sexual assault. She was stripped, and Fred took a leather belt and began brutally whipping her vulva until red raw. Rose stifled her screams with a pillow, and then began to perform cunnilingus on her. One can only imagine the mental and physical torture that those sick, twisted pair put that poor woman through. But it was not quite over yet. The pair kept her bound and gagged in their bedroom, with the threat of her being moved to the cellar and allowing Rose's regular tricks to have their collective way with her, then kill and bury her. Strangely, the pair then calmly asked Owens if she would reconsider returning to her family childcare role, as well as being available for Rose's pleasure. Seeing it as a way of lessening her ordeal, she agreed and convinced the West of her intentions to remain by cleaning the house from top to bottom. Later that day, Owens was able to escape their clutches when she and Rose had gone to the local laundrette, or laundromat for my American friends. Her harrowing ordeal finally over, she made her way home. Her mother had noticed that Caroline was highly withdrawn and didn't seem her usual self. She then noticed the bruises and welts on her arms and legs. Poor Caroline broke down in tears and told her mum everything that had happened to her. Her mother immediately called the police and told them what had happened. In short order, the Wests were arrested and charged. The trial for the case was set for the 12th of January 1973, but sadly, as is so often the case, Caroline could not face having to relive the whole experience in court once more, and withdrew her statement. This meant that all other charges relating to the sexual assault were dropped, leaving them with only charges of actual bodily harm to answer. For this, they pled guilty and were punished with a fine of £50 each. Around £750 today. Caroline did not attend the trial, and when she heard the judgment, she attempted suicide. I cannot even begin to imagine how she felt in that moment. April 1973. Linda Goff, aged 19. Only 3 months after their conviction for the sexual assault of Caroline Owens, the couple committed their first joint murder. Linda Goff had attended a private school and upon the cessation of her education was working as a seamstress who had become friendly with the West family. Perhaps because of her sheltered, privately educated upbringing, she was described as highly naive. Linda had become a regular visitor to the Cromwell Street address. It is rumoured that she had been seeing one of the various male lodgers at the house. Of course, Fred took a keen interest in her. Linda permanently moved in mid-April of 1973. The very next day, she disappeared completely. When the lodgers had asked what had happened to her, the Wests told them that she had been kicked out after having been caught hitting one of the children. A total lie, but a lie they stuck to, even telling Linda's mother when she had asked after her daughter's whereabouts. Linda's remains, mostly bone fragments, were found in a former car inspection pit underneath the floor in the former garage at the back of the house that Fred had converted into a bathroom at the rear of the property. Parts of her skull were found bound with duct tape, and 2 small straws had been found in her nasal cavity. Presumably she had been gagged with tape and the straws put there to allow her to still breathe. Clearly she had been subjected to brutal treatment before she was killed. Circa 10th of November 1973. Carol Ann Kaz Cooper, aged 15. Born in Luton, Bedfordshire, Kaz had moved to Worcestershire later in her early teen years. When she disappeared, she had begun living at the Pines Children's Home in Worcester. It would therefore seem that she had either run away from home or had been orphaned. Not a great deal is known exactly about what happened to Kaz. It is surmised that the West had picked her up while she was hitchhiking. It is known that she had been on her way home from a night out to the cinema with her boyfriend in Warndon and had been staying with her grandmother for a few days. Fred and Rose had suspended her from the rafters in the cellar before subjecting her to violent sexual abuse, and then had murdered and dismembered her. West Mercia police had attempted to track her down, but their inquiries proved fruitless. Kaz's remains were found buried under the floor in the cellar. "27th of December, 1973. Lucy Partington, aged 21. Lucy was born in St Albans to a well-to-do middle-class family that moved to Bishop's Cleeve, Gloucestershire, very soon after her birth. When she grew up in her late teens, she got into Exeter University and had found religion, converting to Catholicism. She came home to the family for Christmas in 1973. She had been visiting a friend's house in Gretton, not far from Winchcombe. It is widely believed that the West picked her up from the bus station there. Certainly she was never seen again once she had left her friend's house. Because of her middle-class background, Lucy's case was one that elicited the most anger from the always highly fickle public. A good parallel to this reaction was the murder of Jane MacDonald by Peter Sutcliffe, the so-called Yorkshire Ripper, 4 years later. I have made a video on this case previously, link in the description. Circa mid-April 1974, Therese Siegenthaler, aged 21. Therese was from Switzerland and was a student at a college in London. She was studying for a diploma in secretarial studies and earned some extra money working at a shoe shop in London's famous Leicester Square at the weekend. For the Easter break of 1974, and confident that she could look after herself, Therese had set out hitchhiking, attempting to make her way to Ireland to visit a friend of hers in the priesthood. She would never make it to the Emerald Isle. Once more, her body was found buried under the floor of the cellar of 25 Cromwell Street. November 14th, 1974. Shirley Hubbard, aged 15. Hailing from Droitwich in Birmingham, young Shirley had gone by 2 other previous surnames, that of Lloyd and Owen. She had suffered a tragic childhood, having been taken into care at the tender age of just 2 years old. She was at a high school in Droitwich and had been taken on for the traditional 2 weeks of work experience by the British department store Debenhams in the city of Worcester. She was last seen on the 14th of November, after having left work, presumably to make her way back home. Her body was eventually found in the new mass grave in the West Cellar. Miss Hubbard would prove to be the youngest victim at the Cromwell Street address. In a case that contains so many tragedies, Shirley Hubbard is one I found particularly saddening. Circa April 1975. Juanita Mott, aged 18. Described as strong-willed, outgoing and rebellious, Juanita had been living in Newent and was believed to have been travelling back to her hometown of Gloucester. She was on her way to a wedding of a friend, but disappeared the day before. Strangely, her disappearance was not reported to the police by her family, but they did contact the media and the Missing Persons Bureau. It does seem rather odd that they would not bother to inform the police as well, but hindsight is a wonderful thing. Following Juanita's murder, Fred decided to concrete over the entire floor of the cellar and convert it into another bedroom for the eldest of the children. For years, they spent their nights sleeping on top of the graves, each one of which having been subjected to increasingly severe sexual abuse before they were killed. Circa May 1978. Shirley Ann Robinson, aged 18. Leicestershire-born Shirley had previously lived in Germany and the West Midlands of England before she had found her way to the West Country. In the April of 1977, Shirley had first encountered the Wests at the Green Lantern Cafe. Fatefully, she had been charmed by the couple and had accepted an offer of a roof over her head from the killer couple. Both Shirley and Rose were pregnant at the time of the move. Very soon after, Rose, who had initially been totally on board with Shirley's presence, had now become deeply resentful of her, seeing her as a threat. Perhaps Fred was paying her more attention than Rose deemed adequate. It should come as no surprise that Rose decided she had to go. But of course, she couldn't just be quietly asked to leave. Her heavily dismembered body was later found buried in the back garden. Her unborn baby had been removed from her, and also cut up. There were no signs of restraint marks on her body, so it is unlikely that she had been abused before her murder. The Wests explained away her sudden disappearance by claiming that Shirley had decided to move to West Germany with her father. Circa August 1979. Alison Chambers, aged 16. A Forces baby, Ali was born at the RAF base in Hanover, West Germany, later moving to Swansea in South Wales. She had become highly rebellious as she progressed through her teen years, a real tearaway, sadly ending up in a children's home in Gloucester. She had received a bit of a leg up when she was taken on through a youth training scheme by a local firm of solicitors, but required constant oversight and attention due to the nature of her personality. Perhaps she had undiagnosed ADHD, but this is purely conjecture on my part. Unfortunately, she had become a frequent visitor to the West household. She was last seen a few days before her 17th birthday. She was assumed to have absconded from her caregiver and was reported to the police and the Missing Persons Bureau. Her body was found buried in the garden of the West's House of Horrors. Following her murder, the couple had discovered a letter from Ali that had been written to her parents. To keep up appearances, they decided to post the letter. They drove all the way to Northamptonshire and dropped it in a random letterbox, meaning Ali's parents would have been reading it, thinking all was well. All the while, their beloved daughter was lying in a shallow grave in the garden of number 25 Cromwell Street. Any attempts to search for Ali's whereabouts would have been thrown off by the Northamptonshire letter. Also, at some point in 1979, Anne-Marie West had run away from her home after she had been discharged from hospital following treatment for an ectopic pregnancy. Upon her return home, she had suffered a particularly savage beating at the hands of Rose. One can only assume the pregnancy had been caused by Fred. This had been the last straw for Anne-Marie. She had managed to escape their oppression, unlike so many young women that had fateful encounters with the Wests. Anne-Marie was one of those small few that got away. At that time, did she know just how lucky she had been in this? 19th of June 1987. Heather Ann West, aged 16. Fred and Rose West's first child as she grew had become increasingly rebellious to the control of her parents, refusing more and more to do as she was commanded. Heather had not long since finished her GCSE exams. Heather and her younger sisters, May and Anne-Marie, were regular victims of abuse, both physical and sexual. When Anne-Marie had run away, the abuse toward the remaining two girls increased significantly, particularly as they reached puberty. Staff at the Hucklecotes Secondary School had raised concerns about Heather's behaviour. She was usually very bright and obedient, but as time went on, had become increasingly difficult to control and withdrawn. She was displaying signs of extreme depression and psychological distress, rocking gently back and forth in her seat and nervously biting her nails while staring off into the unseen distance. She had point-blank refused to change clothes for physical education lessons, no doubt as she felt ashamed of the various marks and signs of abuse on her body. Once she had finished her schooling, she had pinned her hopes on getting a job as a cleaner at a holiday camp down in Torquay in South Devon, far away from the brutality of her parents. Sadly, her application for the job was rejected. If only the recruiter had known that by not giving her that job, they had just sealed poor Heather's fate. This news had broken the last vestiges of hope that she had had. Heather cried all day and night through the 18th and 19th of June, 1987. The following morning, her siblings May and Stephen had left for school. When they returned home in the late afternoon, Heather was gone. Their mum and dad told them that Heather had gone to Torquay and that she had been crying because she was sad at leaving the family. They spun the neighbours a completely different yarn that Heather had run away following a huge argument. The couple changed the story to May and Stephen several times, including saying that she had run off with a lesbian lover or that she had been involved in credit card fraud, all of which were to stop suggestions that her disappearance be reported to the police. It is believed that Heather had threatened to go to the police and report her parents for all the various abuses that she had experienced and witnessed, and this is what had precipitated her murder. Fred was at work all day, so it must have been Rose that had killed and dismembered her body in time for the rest of the family to return home. Their son Barry, then aged 7, claimed to have witnessed Heather's murder. He said that he saw Rose knock her to the floor and stamp on her head around 5 times. Heather would prove to be the last of the West's known victims. Her body was buried beneath the garden patio. Whenever the children had stepped out of line in Fred's eyes, he would threaten them that, "If you don't bloody behave, you'll end up under the patio like Heather." A chilling threat that we have no doubt he would have carried out eventually. Fred would later claim during police interviews, "I mean, Heather, I thought the bloody world of Heather. So anyway, I got to grips with it after a while, and the first thing that came to my mind was, I'm gonna have to take this and sort it out. Which I did. All the messes Rose got herself into, I took the fucking rap for him and helped him out. So, anyway, I said, look, you'll have to tell me exactly what happened. She said that Heather was cut up. Well, I never felt so ill for a few seconds, a few minutes, before I could get to grips with myself again. What on earth you cut her up for? She said she wouldn't fit in the dustbin. Now, the thing that makes it hard is she cut Heather up and chucked her in a fucking dustbin. Her daughter in a dustbin. If he really did think the world of Heather, then why the hell would he have treated her so disgustingly cruel? But it wouldn't surprise me that if in his twisted mind he thought that he was treating her well, especially in relation to the other women that crossed paths with the Wests. In the May of 1992, whilst Rose was out, the rest of the family had heard a terrifying scream coming from upstairs. A little while later, Fred had come down. The children quietly snuck upstairs and found their 13-year-old sister Louise curled up in the corner of one of the bedrooms, sobbing deeply. Fred had raped and sodomized her, and had partially throttled her whilst he did so. Louise told her mum what had happened later that day, but Rose callously replied, "Oh well, you were asking for it." To speak to her daughter in such a way upon the news of such an horrific event speaks volumes as to just how sick in the head Rose was. Louise was raped a further 3 times over the following weeks. Rose watched on one occasion, and on another, Fred actually filmed it. Immediately after the one that Rose had witnessed, she followed her weeping and bleeding daughter into the bathroom and asked her, "Well, what did you expect?" Just let that sink in for a second. A 13-year-old girl. Bastards. A little while later, Louise confided in a school friend just what had happened to her at the hands of her parents. The shocked friend told her own mother, who anonymously phoned the police on the 4th of August, 1992. A search warrant was gained, and the house was raided on the 6th of August, 1992. This search revealed an extensive library of pornographic films, some of which were homemade, and various sex toys and assorted paraphernalia. None of the videos seized featured any of the children or victims. Louise gave a full statement in the presence of an appropriate adult, trained in such cases. Louise's abuse had begun when she was 11. The very next day, the West children were taken into care. They were assessed medically and psychologically. It quickly became apparent that there was far more going on in the West household than met the eye. The evidence of the abuse that they had suffered was immediately apparent. The kids told of the constant threats to get buried under the patio. This worrying element caused the police to widen the scope of their investigation. Following the revelations from the children, Fred West was arrested and charged with 3 counts of rape and 1 of buggery, an offence that has its origins all the way back in the year 1533. Rose was arrested as an accessory and for incitement, as well as child cruelty charges. Both Fred and Rose were questioned on the whereabouts of Heather, but both gave conflicting accounts. Fred said that she had run away, and last heard of, she was supporting herself through prostitution. Of course, he denied any wrongdoing. Rose, on the other hand, had claimed that she had persuaded Heather to move out, in case the children had found out that she was gay, even adding that she had given her £600 to help her find a new place, and she kept occasional contact with her daughter. Based on this, Rose was bailed, pending trial, and ordered not to contact the family, including Fred. Upon hearing of her parents' arrest, Anne-Marie contacted the police and offered her assistance in the investigation. giving them a statement of her own experiences, and agreed to testify in court. Sadly, when she learned of what would happen to her parents if they went to trial, Louise had panicked and withdrawn her statement. The case completely collapsed when Anne-Marie had also decided that she couldn't go ahead with reliving her trauma. She did, however, emphasise to the police that her mum, Rena, and sisters, Charmaine and Heather, had seemingly vanished off the face of the earth. The charges were dropped, and Fred West was reluctantly released. The police did continue the search for the missing persons in the meantime. Thankfully, though, the children remained in the care of the state. Fred and Rose were permitted supervised contact in their home, so at least the chances of any further instances of harm were greatly reduced. The couple claimed to anyone that would listen that the charges were entirely fabricated. Following continued investigations into the disappearances of the two daughters and Rena Costello, Detective Constable Hazel Savage became increasingly convinced that there was some substance to the claim that Heather might well be buried under the patio. She was able to convince her superiors that there was more than enough cause to apply for another search warrant. This one would be far more comprehensive, allowing them to search anywhere they wanted, including the garden. Fred was working away in Stroud on the morning of the 24th of February 1994, the day the police descended mob-handed on 25 Cromwell Street. Immediately, the colour completely drained from Rose's face when she opened the door and saw the outstretched warrant and the multiple officers immediately piling in through the door. She began to panic, calling for her son Stephen to get hold of Fred on the phone. Whilst the officers got to work in dismantling the house and garden, Rose was once again questioned about Heather's whereabouts. In a fit of hysterics, Rose angrily shouted, "I can't fucking remember! It's a bloody long time ago! What do you think I am, a bloody computer?" Fred arrived back 3 hours later. He straight away claimed that Heather was still alive and well, but now embellished the tale by saying that she had gotten involved with a drug-dealing gang. He laughed off the suggestion that Heather was buried under the patio and that this was just vindictive talk from Anne-Marie because of their earlier acquittal, but the police weren't buying that for a second. The search continued through the day, and 2 officers placed there overnight to guard both the front door to prevent anyone leaving, and another to watch over the garden excavations. Fred and Rose stayed up all night, whispering to each other and nervously glancing out the kitchen window into the garden. The following morning, Fred told his eldest son, Stephen, by this time 19 years old, "Look, son, look after your mum and sell the house. I done something really bad, and I want you to go to the papers and make as much money as you can." Clearly Fred could see which way the wind was blowing. When the forensics team arrived a short time later, Fred volunteered to be taken down to the cop shop to tell them what would really happen to Heather. Rose stayed behind, but she would not remain free for long. When Fred West arrived at Bearland Police Station at 11:15 on the 25th of January, he was immediately ushered into an interview room. Because of his illiteracy, it was recommended that Fred have an appropriate adult assigned to him to assist him in understanding the legal process. This service was provided by a bank of trained volunteers. 38-year-old mother of 5 and trainee social worker Janet Leach was put on to Fred's case and joined him and solicitor Howard Ogden. Fred told the interviewing officers that he had murdered Heather, taking the blame away from Rose. He was formally arrested and cautioned. He said that he had strangled Heather in an act of rage during an argument, attempting to make out that it was manslaughter rather than murder. He then told of how he had cut up the body. When the news reached the remaining children, they all understandably broke down in tears. Fred had agreed to go to the house under escort with Janet Leach's helpful presence and show the team where to dig. Once he was back at the property, Fred began to display some highly strange behaviour. He claimed that Heather's spirit was speaking to him, guiding him where to indicate to the investigators. Initially, he intentionally gave the wrong location, but eventually police decided to just dig up the whole garden instead. Fred kept up this rather odd behaviour of hearing voices throughout his various escorted visits to the sites of his known victims. Perhaps he intended to later convince doctors to place him in the mental health system, which is a far easier existence than a standard prison. At around 1600 on the afternoon of the 26th, the excavation team uncovered a human femur in the garden, and more remains were found as they dug deeper. This was shortly followed by another grave containing pieces of multiple bodies in another part of the garden. Investigators were taken aback as they quickly realized that they were dealing with far more than just one murder. They even found a pile of fingernails next to Heather's remains, which would imply that she had had them torn off as a means of torturing her before she had been killed. All the remains were photographed, mapped, and catalogued in situ before they were removed for further examination. The police broke the news of the discoveries at the home to Fred in his jail cell. He decided there was no point in denying things anymore. With the remains of 3 bodies found in the garden, Fred informed the officer in charge of the inquiry that he wished to confess to a further 9 murders and the locations of where he had disposed of the bodies. Rose was moved to a different address by the police, to a place in Dursley. Between the 5th to the 8th of March, the investigating team broke through the concrete in the cellar and found the various pieces of bodies buried there. During the extensive and lengthy interrogations over the next few weeks, privately to Janet Leach, Fred confessed that he had committed somewhere between 20 to 30 murders, but without bodies being discovered, he could only be charged with the ones they could confirm, which are the ones that we have covered above. He had admitted that he picked up and murdered a young woman called Mary Bastholm in 1968, burying her body near Bishop's Cleeve, but so far the attempts to find her resting place have remained fruitless. Fred had insisted that Rose was never involved in any of the murders, but the police became increasingly convinced otherwise. Rose was arrested on suspicion of murder on the 20th of April 1994. Whilst being held on remand at HMP Birmingham awaiting trial, on the morning of Sunday the 1st of January 1995 at unlock time, Fred West was found hanging in his cell. He had fashioned a ligature from old blankets which he had secured to the bars of his cell. He was 53 years old. He had originally been placed on 24-hour suicide watch, meaning that he would have to be checked every 15 minutes. Clearly, either this had not been kept up, or he had managed to get it done in between the checks. In his cell was found a suicide note. At the bottom of it, he had drawn a gravestone, onto which he had scrawled his own epitaph. In loving memory, Fred West. Rest in peace, where no shadow falls. In perfect peace, he waits for Rose, his wife. The trial of Regina versus Rosemary Pauline West began on the 3rd of October 1995 at Winchester Crown Court, with Mr. Justice Charles Mantell presiding. Brian Levison, QC, spoke for the prosecution. The same Brian Levison who would go on to head the parliamentary investigation into the News of the World phone hacking and press ethics scandal of the early 2010s. In his opening statement, Mr. Levison said of the bodies discovered in both houses, "Secrets more terrible than words can express. The victim's last moments on earth were as objects of the depravity of this woman and her husband." The trial lasted for 7 weeks. The whole sordid tale of the killer couple's crimes were gone over in the finest of detail. Anne-Marie appeared before the court and described the catalogue of abuse that she and her siblings had been subjected to. Janet Leach's integrity was brought into question by the prosecution, heavily implying that she had been coerced by Fred into sympathizing with him, a fact she vehemently denied on the stand. It is true that she had maintained contact with Fred after questioning had ceased and her role no longer required, regularly visiting him whilst he was on remand. It was pointed out to the court that she had seemed highly distressed by the news of Fred's suicide, but she countered, saying, "I was desperate. I couldn't sleep at night. I kept having nightmares about all those poor girls in the cellar, but I felt that I had to keep talking to Fred. Otherwise, how would the families ever know what had happened to them?" The trial was not without a moment of intense drama as well. Leach had just falsely denied that she had agreed to sell her story to the Daily Mirror newspaper. Right after answering the question, Mrs. Leach suffered a stroke right there on the witness stand. She was rushed to hospital and treated. A few days afterwards, she returned to the court and amended her previous claim, admitting to the deal with the newspaper. This did very little to help the defence, though. The mountain of evidence was still damning against Rose and her 9 counts of murder. The jury was directed to take the circumstantial evidence into account, and that if a couple commit crimes together, they are equally guilty, regardless of who actually did the deed. Rose West was found guilty on all 9 counts and sentenced to life imprisonment with the recommendation that a whole life tariff be imposed. She would spend the rest of her days behind bars, never to see the sweet light or feel the gentle breeze of freedom ever again. For many years, Rose was incarcerated at the now-defunct HMP Holloway. While she was there, she met another infamous female killer, Myra Hindley, who was also serving a whole-life tariff for the awful Moors murders in the 1960s. The two had struck up a friendship and were also rumoured to be in a physical relationship, at one point even sharing a cell. The two did have a falling out, and right up to Myra's death in November of 2002, they didn't speak to each other again. Weirdly and astoundingly, Myra looked down on Rose for what she did. She was reminded of her own despicable deeds, but replied that at least her victims weren't her own children. I have no words for that. Rose allegedly had another famous suitor in 2002 when she announced her engagement to Dave Glover, who had become the regular bass player for the glam rock band Slade. Yes, the "It's Christmas" guys. This led to his immediate firing from the band. Although Glover denied that it was true, Rose called off the alleged engagement a few days later. Today, a 69-year-old Rose West is still serving her sentence at HMP New Hall, near Wakefield. Fred and Rose West rank amongst the most notorious serial killers in the whole of British history, and perhaps even in the world. To take the lives of your own children, let alone strangers, must take a particular kind of sick, twisted mind. Fred was clearly a master manipulator with a vicious, sadistic streak, coupled with a rampant sex drive that led him to treat all of the females in his life, whether related or not, like his personal toys, to do with as he pleased. Rose, whilst she was entirely submissive to Fred, had learned to use sex to get what she wanted from men. Of course, the treatment she suffered at the hands of her father did not help in forming her personality along lines that you or I would consider to be normal. But this should not be used as a shield to hide behind. She was still a monster, just as much as Fred. She was actively complicit in the murders, and never thought to do the right thing and inform the authorities. The house at number 25 Cromwell Street was demolished soon after the case was concluded. The space it occupied is now a footpath. A couple of clues still exist on the adjacent building of the old House of Horrors. Many people using the footpath today probably don't even realise that they are walking on the former graves of so many poor innocent women and girls. The house at number 25 Midland Road still exists. You have to feel for the current residents if they know about the history of that place. Must send a shiver down their spines. There are many parallels between these two and the Moors murderers Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, as mentioned earlier. I have already covered the Moors murderers in an earlier video, link in the description. Both of the female partners in those couples had attempted to claim that they were the victims of an oppressive man, but they aren't fooling anybody. Both of them were equally as culpable as the other. Where the cases differ greatly is on the male counterpart. Ian Brady was fiercely intelligent, whereas Fred definitely wasn't. What they shared in common, though, was an innate ability to manipulate the women in their lives. In 2021, following an ITV documentary, fresh leads surfaced from previously unreleased documents that there could well have been as many as a further 20 possible murders that Fred was responsible for at properties that Fred West did some building work on, as well as around the area that Rena and Anne's bodies were discovered. Added to this were areas of interest quite far afield, from Bristol to Birmingham, and even further north. Excavation works were carried out in a few of these places by forensic examiners, and specially trained dogs, trained to sniff out dead bodies, were brought in. Geophysics teams with ground-penetrating radar equipment have extensively scoured the areas. This has led to the discovery of 2 new graves, although it is not clear at this point if they are connected to the Wests. The result of the 7-month-long investigation were presented in a separate programme by British news broadcasting legend Sir Trevor MacDonald, who broke the news of the original case 27 years previously. So the case is not quite over, even now. ITV also made a whole dramatisation of the case called Appropriate Adult, beginning from the day of the search warrant for the garden being served, right through to Rose's conviction, following the involvement of Janet Leach. Fred is portrayed perfectly by Dominic West, no relation. It can be viewed for free on ITV.com. According to Janet Leach, during her many conversations with Fred, he alluded to some sort of child-killing cult that Fred and Rose may have been part of. This supposed cult is said to have also included Fred's brother, John, near Much Marcle. He had said that the children were abducted and taken to the barn, suspended from the rafters, tortured and murdered. The exact location of this mysterious barn has never been conclusively determined, but Sir Trevor MacDonald did identify a highly likely candidate in his documentary mentioned above. If this is true, this could well take the West's total number of victims up to near 100 plus. A highly troubling thought. It is true that John had been arrested and charged with sexual assault of 2 underage girls, but had committed suicide on the eve of the jury retiring to consider his verdict. Talk about being cut from the same cloth. Excerpts from the interview tapes that Fred gave to the police are available to listen to and make for truly sobering listening. I'll link one in the description, and another to the full transcript of Fred's admission of Heather's murder. One common aspect of this case, hitchhiking, is a highly rare thing to see in Britain these days, especially lone females. When one considers just what happened to the poor ladies in this case, this drop-off is definitely not a bad thing. Anne-Marie went on to write an autobiography called Out of the Shadows, where she outlined the brutal treatment at the hands of her evil father and stepmother. Anne-Marie would attempt to take her own life in 1999. Stephen West was jailed in 2004 for sex with an underage girl. No doubt a product of his upbringing, although this cannot excuse such behaviour, but at least goes toward explaining why. He has said that he has worked extremely hard to turn his life around since his release. Mae West has gone on to write a book about her parents and the children's upbringing entitled Love as Always, Mum, and features extracts from the letters that Rosa sent her from prison. Mae had been forced to watch pornography with her father and had been raped by her uncle at the tender age of just 5 years old. Rose had once cut her chest multiple times with a knife following a heated argument. I do not even want to think about what she and her siblings went through. Tara West told the Mirror newspaper, "I realised now that Dad was only interested in his natural daughters. He thought they were his property. Because I wasn't his daughter, he left me alone." Barry West was found dead in a hospital in Maidstone, Kent, in 2020 from a suspected overdose, having fought a long battle with addiction. Fred West was a coward who knew nothing, who knew that he would surely face the iron rod of justice and had chosen to take the easy way out, rather than take the punishment that he truly deserved. He was the sort that felt more than capable of beating women, but could not stand up to a man, like most abusing scumbags. His suicide left Rose to take the whole rap. Rose still languishes in prison, and I think I speak for everyone when I say that I hope she is suffering every passing, lingering day with the burden of what she had done. When the end does come for her, we shall all be well rid of that utterly disgusting monster. Their remaining children will have to live the rest of their lives with the scars that their parents left them all with. I truly hope that they all find their own version of solace. And may their many poor, unfortunate victims' souls find rest in everlasting love and peace. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it informative and entertaining. If you did, please like and subscribe and ding the bell to be informed of whenever I put out new content. Feel free to comment your thoughts on this case below, or ask me anything. I will happily answer as many as I can. And don't forget to share with a friend. Literally takes a couple of seconds. If you wish to do so, you can now support DID on Patreon or via the Super Thanks button, link in the description. Don't forget to swing by the DID merch store and grab a sweet t-shirt, hoodie or mug and fly the flag for all to see. It really is the best way to support the channel, as you will have something practical and I will be able to slog on and keep making more devilishly gruesome videos like this one. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.